something is happening in the heavens. There's a shifting, there's a shattering, there's something is going on. It looked like almost like a dimensional shift that was taking place. It's like watching a Star Wars movie and warp speed. Everything just went, just into a streak and then to a flash of light and boom. Like the Apostle Paul says, I don't know if I was in the body or out of the body. All I know is I was caught up to paradise. Well, I'm not claiming it was equal to that, but I'm saying it was more than a dream somehow. Because to this day, all these years later, it is so fresh. I can still smell the smells. I can still see the sights. Yes, I can smell smells. I mean, it was unbelievable. It was like I physically was somewhere else. But it wasn't an out-of-body experience that I knew I was out of my body. It was like, I thought it was a dream. Until I woke up, and then it was so startlingly real that it took me several years before I shared it with anybody, because it kind of freaked me out. Here's what happened. So I go to bed, go to sleep. All right. In my dream/vision, whatever, I dreamed that I was standing in a field, and it was nighttime, and I was looking at the expanse of the sky. I mean, I might have been in big sky country or something. I mean, there's no mountains, there are no buildings in front of me, just the horizon, the beauty of the heavens. It was breathtaking. Behind me, I could hear the sounds of life. I could hear horns honking, people talking, conversations. I couldn't make out specific words, but like multitudes of people talking, cheering, maybe watching a ball game. Heard babies crying, not in terror or anything, just baby talk and crying and people talking. It was the sounds of life. I never turned around. I don't know if I was prohibited from doing that. I had no inkling to do it. I was looking at the expanse of the sky. Beautiful, beautiful night. Hearing all of the sounds behind me of life. Not a care in the world. As I was watching the stars and constellations, and I can remember in my dream identifying a couple of the constellations that I know and literally seeing them. And then the next thing I know is that the stars begin to take on colors. And I see these colors in my dream, and I can remember thinking, not only is this beautiful, but this is very unusual. I don't know that I've ever seen this phenomenon before. And then I would see things streaking across the sky, maybe like a comet or something, but it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen with colors involved in it. And then some of the constellations began to kind of almost swirl, not like a fan, but I mean just kind of started moving like that. And then they started shifting positions a little bit. Then I can remember thinking, okay, something supernatural is going on. Now all this is happening in my mind as I'm watching. I'm still hearing the sounds of life. Then I hear the sounds of life behind me getting a little more panicked. It's like they're seeing it too, and they don't know what to make of it. I can remember that I didn't have a feeling of terror. I had a feeling of awe and wonder and thinking something is happening in the heavens. There's a shifting, there's a shattering, there's something is going on. Supernatural. And then the stars appeared, literally, to fall from the sky. Not just fall, but to be zooming towards the earth. At the same time that it looked like, well, now I know the scriptures that talk about the heavens being rolled up like a scroll. It looked like almost like a dimensional shift that was taking place. And then the streaking coming down, and then the sounds of life behind me. Holy terror. People were shrieking, screaming. You could hear people, oh my God. And and then sirens were going off and warning sounds. And it was like something cataclysmic was happening. I'm still watching it. It was happening so quickly. And I remember thinking, well, I don't have any fear in me. The next thing I know, there's a presence beside me. I'm not allowed to look, or I didn't look, but I was aware that I was in the arms of a presence, or in the midst of a presence, a personal presence. And the next thing I know, I'm just being lifted up. And I'm not talking about some kind of cheesy movie of the rapture or anything. It was real. It was smooth. It was peaceful. I look over to my left, and now the whole time I hadn't looked left or right, but now look, my wife is right there. And she's such a woman of God, and she knew the Lord long before I did, and she's looking at me, she's smiling, and we just had this knowing look. We didn't even communicate, but we knew what was happening. and we get whisked up, and the next thing I know, it's like watching a Star Wars movie and warp speed. Everything just went, just into a streak and then to a flash of light, and boom, it's like we bursted through another dimension, if you will, a barrier of some sort. No fear ever. And I'm still aware of this presence, that we were under the control of a benevolent presence. And the next thing I saw was we busted through, I'm just going to call it a dimensional shift. We busted through another dimension, and before me was the most beautiful. It had to be what the earth looked like when it was first formed by the hand of God. The colors were so vibrant. The air smelled like potpourri. I can still smell that sometimes. I saw what looked like villages, beautiful, beautiful little homes, and flowers everywhere. You could hear children off in the distance just laughing, having a blast. People, the peace was overwhelming. The sun was just magnificent. And I can remember asking the presence, is this heaven? Is this paradise? And then I heard the voice, and it just said, this is where you will live forever. Welcome home. And I looked at my wife, she smiled, and I woke up. I was furious. I did not want to wake up. I thought that's got to be what dying is like for a believer. Once you're there, you don't want to go back. I mean, even if there are loved ones behind, somehow it's all going to be taken care of. You don't want to go back, not after smelling and tasting and seeing this. The Apostle Paul said that. He said, look, I'm telling you, your mind can't conceive. Your ear has never heard, your eyes have never seen. And he was caught up to paradise. He's the one that said, I don't know if I was in the body or out of the body, but I went somewhere. And I saw things and I heard things that I'm not even permitted to tell at all. So I had something similar to that happen to me. I'm not comparing myself to the Apostle Paul. My experience was not near as complete or as detailed as his or John's or Daniel's, but that happened to me. Now, it was so real and so profound. It was unlike anything. I thought to myself, before I share this with anybody, if I ever do, I'm going to give it some days and some weeks to see if it kind of goes away. You know how you can have a vivid dream and you think, well, I'll never forget that. And then 3 months later, you don't remember anything. It's gone. Okay. So I just thought, let me just see if that happens. Well, the weeks went by and all I could do was think about it. Not all I could do, but often I would think about this and just kind of like go into ecstasy, just close my eyes. Oh, please let me go back, please. So I caught myself going to sleep at night, saying, Lord, could you take me back there? Just take me back there. But it never happened. I never had anything like that before then. I've never had anything like that since then. So here's what I shared with the congregation. Because now your viewers are listening and say, well, that's pretty cool, but you could just have bad pizza that night, or you could be lying. You could be making this up. So I know that. This is why I didn't share it. But here's what happened. Some years later, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 years later, my wife and I are very close. We have been since we were married. And we try every afternoon if we're together. I travel a lot. If we're together, just sit down, have a cup of coffee, just talk for an hour, just talk. So we were doing that one day, years after my dream. Several times I started to tell her this dream, but I just hesitated. I just thought, I know my wife would believe me, but it's so amazing. How do you describe that? How do you describe that beyond a dream? How do you say it was a dream, but it wasn't? It was more than that. How do you describe that? I didn't know how to put it in words, so I didn't. Well, anyway, years later, sitting down, having coffee, my wife is there, and I said, I got to tell you something that happened to me. And I said, please don't think I'm crazy. And she kind of laughed. Well, I already think that. We've known each other since we were 10. So I mean, we're great buddies. We're having a good time. And I said, so I told her just what I related to you. She's just spellbound looking at me. She didn't say a word. And I'm thinking she thinks I'm nuts. But when I finished, these were her words. She said, you need to ask your grandson about his rapture dream. She says, I said, what do you mean? What are you talking about? She says, he's coming this afternoon. And he had it years ago when he was just a little boy. Like maybe 3 or 4 years old. And now he's much older. She says, but he's coming this afternoon to the house. She says, I'm not going to say a word to him. And she said, when he walks in the door, sit him down and just say to him, his name's Parker. Parker, tell me about your rapture dream. And she said, I want you to just be quiet and listen to him. I said, okay. I didn't have it. I said, why are you being so mysterious about this? She said, you're going to love it. You need to ask him. So I'm thinking, well, he's had something similar, so he comes. I ask him, come in and ask him. Before we go, I think we're going to go play a little golf that day or something. I said, before we go, I said, sit down for a minute, I want to talk to you. And so I asked him, I said, he calls his grandmother Giggy. That's how he was trying to say grandmother when he was 1 year old, I think, and it just stuck. So I said, Giggy said to ask you about your rapture dream. Well, he kind of snapped his head around and looked at her like, is it okay if I tell him? And he looked back, he said, sure. And he said, I've never told it to anybody but Giggy. And I said, okay, well, she told you to tell me because I've got something to tell you. And he said, okay. First words out of his mouth. Well, Papa, he said, I was standing in a field and I was looking up into the sky. Basically, he describes everything that happened to me. I mean, seriously, he said, he didn't call it the sounds of life. He said, I heard people behind me. He said, it sounded like a big city, but he said, I didn't turn around. I never saw it. I just heard it. And he said, but I'm looking at the sky, and he said, then the stars started moving, and I thought, how freaky is that? And he said, they started changing colors, and then he just describes the whole thing, except he has more detail. He gets it right up to the point where everything's kind of, the dimensions are shifting. The sky, there's like streaks are coming down, like the stars are falling from the heavens. And then he says, but I realized, Papa, that these weren't stars, these were angelic beings. And he says, and we were swept up. And he said, I was swept up. And he said, it was like I was in some kind of like a chariot or something. And he said, and there was an angel that had his arms around the whole thing. He said, I saw him. He said, I talked to him. And he says, and then we were whisked. And he says, and you and Giggy were there. And I think he called it a couple of others, his mom, dad, people he knew. And he said, I saw their faces and we're just going. But he said, but it wasn't a long trip. It was instant. And the next thing you know, he says, we're in, I forgot what he called it, paradise, I'm going to use the word, in this beautiful place, whatever a small kid would say. And he kind of describes it like me. And then he said, and then I woke up. And I said, and then my wife's over there now, she's got tears, and she says, I told you. She says, y'all had the very same dream. She said, that's impossible, unless God's speaking. Well, this story gets more fantastic. So I'm listening to all this. I'm celebrating that. I said, have you told your mom and dad? They said, no. I said, do you mind if I tell them? He said, no, I don't mind at this point. So I told them. They were blown away by the whole thing. Okay, so that's cool. Now it's a family thing. And, of course, we all believe each other. Now, my grandson, when he was just little, I don't know, 3 or 4, he didn't know anything about chariots and angels and rapture. But yet that's the dream he had. And he's describing it now that he's older. He's saying that's what happened. He didn't know anything about mine, so how could he have made up the stars and the colors and the people behind them? And, it's exactly the same as mine. So, but now it's in the family, and we're kind of glorying in it, celebrating in it, enjoying the peace of it. And we're all thinking, what does this mean? And we all kind of came to the same conclusion that God's revealing stuff, because you can get on the internet, read about Jesus visions, that Jews are having Jesus visions, Muslims are having rapture dreams. Some people are seeing hell, some people are seeing heaven. They die, they come back. It's all over the place. And it's just like exploding forward. And people may say, well, maybe people in every generation have had this. Yeah, but not every generation has had a thing called the internet and YouTube and Facebook. And so now it's everywhere. People are talking about it. So I told my family, I said, I don't know. I said, I'm a preacher of the word. We're a minister's family. We all have ministries. And through the mouth of a child, see? Psalm says, out of the mouths of babes, I will, give my praise. Then through the mouth of I'm going to call myself an old man, a pastor, preacher, a grandfather, your sons and daughters will prophesy.
I'm going to put a part 2 to this, Saints. You have to watch part 2. It continues. It's very exciting. Thank you for listening.